Hello and welcome to the American Experience. I'm David McCullough. The realities were obvious. It was flat, treeless country where you couldn't count on rain and the wind blew all the time. On old maps it had been sensibly labeled the Great American Desert. But steel plows could cut the heavy sod, and with the introduction of a new variety of winter wheat called Turkey Red, the prospects for farming on the southern plains seemed limitless. The rain will follow the plow, it was said in good faith, and for a while there truly seemed no end to the bounty, until the 1930s, the bad time. One rainless, baking summer followed another. The winds gathered terrible force, and the powder-dry land just blew away. People saw everything they'd worked for destroyed, fields in ruin, children choking on dust. Desperate farmers, families by the thousands, gave up and moved on, taking to the road. The grapes of wrath will always come to mind. I like to think how nice it's maybe going to be in California, says Ma Jode. Actually, the great majority of farmers, at least 3 out of 4, stayed where they were. They hung on, refusing to give up. And it's their story that follows, told largely by sons and daughters who were there and remember. Much of the nation never fully comprehended. Places like Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado were all so far away. But how many today think of the Dust Bowl as just something that came and went in another time? The wind still blows on the plains, and for all the strides made in holding back erosion, the soil, true wealth, keeps blowing away. In some places, as much as 8 tons of soil per acre every year, all carried off by the wind.
I believe any man must see the beauty in mile upon mile of level land where the wheat is waist high, sways to the slightest breeze, and is turning a golden yellow under a flaming sun. It was evening when a huge bank of dark rain clouds formed in the northwest. As the storm approached, I could feel its coolness, smell it, almost taste it. I waited in suspense, looking, hoping, praying for rain. But the rain did not come.
(1935). After years of drought and dust, the land was now being destroyed by another kind of plague. Hundreds of thousands of starving jackrabbits came down from the hills, devouring everything in their path. Dust bowlers were forced to begin an extermination campaign. Almost every Sunday, people gathered to take part in rabbit drives.
When we first came over the hill there on this one drive, there were a big line of us. It just looked like the country below us just all began to move. Looked like a herd of sheep, but it was jackrabbits. The first rabbit drive that I ever witnessed was with shotguns, but that was kind of dangerous, so then they decided later that they'd have some more of these rabbit drives and would just use clubs. So they would form lines of people, and these lines of people would march down through that country and come together and funnel these rabbits into those pens. And any that tried to get back by you, which would be a lot of them, why, you were supposed to knock them in the head with a club as they came by. And then after they got them all in these pens, why, the young fellows would get in those pens with these clubs, which was like an old axe handle or something like this, and just club them to death. I can imagine, you know, what the Humane Society would say about that now. Whew.
You could hear the rabbits screaming, you know. That's what was scary to me. I think that sound affected everyone. I know it sounded terrible to me as a little girl. And I'd think, sounds like a baby crying or squealing or, you know, being hurt. It was really sad. And then this dirt storm was coming in at that time. But it was starting to get dark. And, you know, know, some people felt that was the wrath of God coming up on them when they'd kill these rabbits like this.
April 14th, 1935, was the worst day of them all. The day no dust bowler would forget. The day they would call Black Sunday.
Everybody tried to get out of there. Everybody was scrambling to get out to their vehicles and find their families. It looked real black as it came in, just big old rolls just coming in.
As the dark clouds approached, there was an ominous silence. Minutes later, the stillness was shattered by thousands of birds fleeing before the avalanche of dirt.
And back in the north, there's just a little bank, looked like about 8 or 10 feet high. But it had one of those headers out on each end, you know. And I did a few things there around the chickens and everything, went back in the house, and I said, Dad, we ain't gonna be able to go to church tonight. And he said, why? And that's how fast it's traveling.
My dad went into the kitchen when that dirt was blowing the hardest. The wind was really whipping. And I can remember my dad going in there and taking hold of those 2x4s, and his hands would move up and down 5 or 6 inches. This wind was whipping so hard. And I thought to myself, this thing may blow away.
When the storm hit, my father described us. I remember Daddy taking me, and he set us right with the car. And he said, stay there, don't move. Well, I wasn't about to move. And so then the neighbor man was crying, and his family was all crying. And so Daddy went over and tried to help him, and he was sticking his hanky in the radiator, you know, and putting it on his face, and he'd say, oh, God, we're gonna die. He said, we're all gonna die, and Daddy's finally just said, hush, you help me take care of these kids. That's when he told him, he said, you get your family in your car, and I will bumper you home.
Terrified residents tried to drive through the blinding dust. One Kansas farmer, disoriented, drove his car off the road. Searchers found him the next day, suffocated.
My dad thought that we should stop and pick up this neighbor and her baby. And it hit just about the time we were getting out of the car to go into the house. And this woman was hysterical. She thought she should maybe just go ahead and kill the baby and herself because it was the end of the world, and she didn't want to face it alone. And so my dad quoted Bible scriptures to her to prove that it was not yet time for the end of the world, that he had no idea what this was, but it was certainly not the end of the world.
After Black Sunday, others turning to the Bible found support for their worst fears. The Lord shall make the rain of thy land powder and dust, they read. From heaven it shall come down upon thee, until thou be destroyed.
The spring of 1935, the wind blew 27 days and nights without quitting. And I remember that's when my mother I thought she was gonna go crazy, because you got desperate. Because if the wind blew during the day or during the night and let up, you got some relief. But just day and night, 24 hours, one 24 hour after the other, but it's 27 days and nights, the spring of 1935, that it didn't let up.
Living on the plains was becoming an act of sheer will. The dust was beginning to make living things sick. Animals were found dead in the fields, their stomachs coated with 2 inches of dirt. People spat up clods of dirt, sometimes 3 to 4 inches long and as big around as a pencil. An epidemic raged throughout the plains. They called it dust pneumonia. Many residents tried their own home remedies.
Skunk grease. We had a neighbor that trapped skunks, and he would save the fat and render it out, and supposedly that skunk grease, skunk oil, penetrates your chest better, but we never liked to use it.
Mother would give us sugar with a drop of coal oil on it or a drop of turpentine, and this would clear the phlegm out of our throats.
Mom would mix kerosene and lard And nowadays we have Crisco, but then we had lard, you know, and she would mix those together. I suppose it would have blistered if they hadn't used lard in it, but she'd rub our throats. Oh, we'd be covered with it, and I hated it because it would stink so.
In 1935, 1/3 of the deaths in Ford County, Kansas, resulted from pneumonia. Children were especially vulnerable.
I guess I was sicker than I ever realized because I got delirious. I was out of my head. I can see to this day those merry-go-round horses coming out of the ceiling. You know, they're just like this, just like a merry-go-round horse goes. And I'd say, Mom, she was always there by my bed, it seemed like. I say, Mom, those horses are going to hit you. I said, you better move your head. And she'd move her head over. I said, boy, that one like to got you. And so I don't really know how sick I was, but I was pretty sick. I think she thought a time or two I wasn't going to make it.
I had a little brother that had pneumonia 3 times, and I've always felt it was caused from too much dirt. I remember Mother gave him his medicine in the spoon. I stayed in the room with her because we had to sit up with him all night. And she put this medicine in a spoon and put it in his mouth. And he swallowed it and laid back in her arms. Excuse me. But I'll never forget how that affected my mother. She started screaming, and she just held him so tight. And even though she had several children, you know, you have people say, well, you have several children. If you lose one, it won't matter. That's not true. Because this affected Mother in a way that she was never the same again. I cried myself to sleep, I think, every night for a year because of losing him. But I think the worst thing about that was that I was the one that brought the measles home to, you know, I was in school and I took the measles and I came home with him, and if he hadn't got the measles, he might have come out of it, but they said pneumonia and measles, they never did.
By the end of 1935, with no substantial rainfall in 4 years, some residents were giving up. Dust bowlers watched as their neighbors and friends picked up and headed west in search of farm jobs in California. Having packed their meager belongings, they didn't even bother to shut the door behind them. They just drove away, their eyes fixed on the uncertain road before them.
Many of them came by the courthouse, and they'd come by to see me and say, Judge, you know, we've reached the end of our rope. We don't have anything left. We've got to get out of here. And they'd say to me, you know, we need a second-hand tire pretty bad. Well, of course, I always signed orders authorizing the local filling stations to give them a cheap second-hand tire, cost about $3.50, and a tank full of gasoline. And they were very pleased about it. But I'll tell you, they were gaunt, tired-looking people. I felt very sorry for them. The whole family, the wife, the kids, they were tired-looking people. People that you could see that felt rather hopeless.
In the spring of 1939, after the failure of 7 wheat crops in 8 years, Lawrence Svoboda abandoned his farm and fled, convinced that the Dust Bowl was creating an American Sahara. Six months later, the skies finally opened. Nearly a decade of dirt and dust was coming to an end.
When the rain came, it meant life itself. It meant a future. It meant that there would be something better ahead of you. And we as young people and sometimes parents, you'd go out in that rain and just feel that rain hit your face. It was a very emotional time when you'd get rain because it meant so much to you. You didn't have false hope anymore. You knew then that you was going to have some crops.
There'd be lightning back in the northwest. You see the flickering lightning. And Dad would say, that'll be in there about 2 o'clock in the morning. But the rains were so welcome and they smelled so good, and I could lay and listen to them pitter-patter on the side of the old house at night and really sleep, because it was a wonderful feeling.
With the return of the rain, dry fields soon overflowed with golden wheat. The harsh years of the Dust Bowl had forced farmers to accept the limits of the land. But with fortunes to be made once more on the southern plains, that wisdom would soon be tested. In western Kansas, a group of farmers gathered on the steps of the local courthouse. One was hopeful about the future. People are thinking differently about taking care of the land, he said. Don't fool yourself, another replied. You can't convince me we've learned our lesson. It's just not in our blood to play a safe game.